I never saw it coming, honestly. Isn't that what people say? We go about our days and nights thinking we know who we are and the people we're closest to. We assume that after a certain age, those wild impulses, those sparks of reckless daring, have long faded away, like forgotten ashes in the bottom of a fire pit. But that weekend changed everything. Marian was my best friend. We'd grown up together, raised our children, and supported each other through the tragedies and triumphs that came with decades of friendship. Her husband, Howard, was a distant sort, always polite, rarely outspoken. He was just there, like the wallpaper. Over the years, I never thought much about him beyond the man who stood quietly by her side. Then they stayed at my home for a long weekend, and in the late hours after Marian had gone to bed, Howard and I shared moments I'd never anticipated, and I was left standing in the quiet shadow of my own actions. What followed was a spiral of feelings, decisions, and consequences that I never dreamed would come for a woman of my age. So here I am now, piecing it all together. The lies we tell ourselves, the hidden corners of our hearts that even we don't dare to look at until someone else sees them. What began as an innocent visit evolved into a story that would haunt me, unraveling secrets and truths, leading to choices that no one would have expected. I wonder if anyone can say they truly know themselves. Because after what happened that weekend, I'm no longer sure I can. The lake was calm, silver blue under the late afternoon light, and the leaves on the old oak trees had just started to turn. From my kitchen window, I watched a single orange leaf flutter to the ground, feeling the weight of the years it represented. I glanced at the old clock on my wall, its ticking the only sound in my small home. They'd be here soon. My best friend Marian and her husband Howard were coming for the weekend, an idea that had seemed delightful when she'd suggested it over the phone. "It's been too long since we've seen each other properly, Evelyn," she'd insisted. "Let's just have some time to breathe, talk, and relax without anything pulling us away." She was right, of course. Life had pulled us in different directions over the years, and though we called often enough, there was a distance between us that felt new. I couldn't quite explain it, and I wondered if she felt it too. But she sounded excited when we made our plans, and I wanted to believe this weekend could bridge that silent gap. Still, something in me was oddly hesitant. Part of me blamed the recent changes I'd seen in her. She was still my best friend, still the Marian who knew my childhood secrets, but she'd been growing into someone I struggled to recognize. Marian had always cared about appearances, but over the years, that side of her seemed to harden. She kept a perfect, magazine-ready home, threw elaborate parties for clients and friends, and told stories of her work as a gallery manager, as though it were a grand production. I knew she was proud of it all, and I didn't begrudge her that. But I couldn't help feeling that I no longer had a place in that world. The sound of tires crunching up my driveway pulled me back to the present. I straightened the napkin on the kitchen counter, heart fluttering in a way I hadn't expected. I walked to the front door just in time to see them emerge from the car, Marian looking as radiant as ever in her fitted jacket and pearl earrings, her short hair swept stylishly to one side. Howard climbed out from the driver's side, his graying hair cropped close, his glasses catching the light. "Evelyn." Marian's voice was warm as she came up the walk, her arms outstretched. I stepped forward, pulling her into a hug, feeling a familiar sense of comfort even as I noticed how thin she'd gotten. "Look at you," she said, pulling back and studying me. "It's like you never age." "Ha," I laughed, waving a hand, knowing full well the crow's feet had come to stay. "You're too kind." Howard smiled politely, standing a little behind her. He gave me a nod, then hugged me with a courteous awkwardness, the way you would an aunt you didn't see often. His face, though creased with age, was still handsome in a subtle, understated way. As we stood there exchanging pleasantries, I caught him watching me, his gaze softer, more lingering than I would have expected. We moved inside, where I poured glasses of iced tea, and we chatted about the drive up, about the changing colors of the leaves, about the weather and the quiet of my neighborhood. I led them to their guest room, showing Marian where she could hang her clothes in the closet, pointing out where I'd put fresh towels. "Oh, Evelyn, this is perfect," Marian sighed, looking out the window to the lake beyond. "I don't know how you can stand to live in such peace all the time. It's so restful." "It has its moments," I said, glancing back at Howard, who was quietly taking in the space, hands in his pockets. For a second, our eyes met, and there it was again, that same soft, lingering look, like he was seeing something about me that I couldn't quite understand myself. Dinner that evening was a simple affair. Roast chicken, a green salad, some of my mother's old recipes. We ate outside on the deck as the sun lowered, casting a warm orange glow over the lake. Marian was as chatty as ever, recounting stories from her work and updates on mutual friends. I could tell she had Howard's polite interest, though he'd heard these stories before. He chimed in occasionally, but mostly he just listened, his attention drifting more often than not. After the plates were cleared, Marian yawned and declared she'd had more than her fill. She stood, stretching her arms, and bid us good night, saying she'd see us both in the morning. I watched her disappear down the hall, feeling the silence settle between Howard and me. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice light as I stacked plates, "I suppose I should call it a night too." But Howard held up his hand. "Here, let me help you clean up." He smiled, taking a few plates from my hands. "Oh no, really, you're a guest," I protested. He just shook his head and started collecting dishes from the table. "You can call me stubborn, but I'm not letting you do this alone." We moved in comfortable silence as we washed and dried dishes together. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me in that same way he had earlier, his gaze quietly assessing. Thoughtful. There was something unspoken in his look, something that made my heart beat faster despite myself. As the last dish was put away, I thanked him, feeling an odd reluctance to end the night. I poured us each a small glass of wine, and we moved back to the deck where the night had grown cool. Howard leaned against the railing, sipping slowly, his eyes distant. "This place," he said softly, "it's like something out of a memory. You're lucky, Evelyn." "Sometimes," I replied, watching his profile against the darkening sky. "Though I imagine it might feel quiet compared to the life you're used to." A small, sad smile crossed his lips. Quiet isn't always a bad thing. For a moment he seemed to be searching for words, his hand tightening on the glass. "Do you ever wonder how life might have been different, Evelyn, if you'd made other choices?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said, setting my glass down and looking out at the lake. "Doesn't everyone? But we can't change the past." "No," he murmured. "But maybe we can make new choices." I turned to him, surprised by the look in his eyes, soft, almost wistful. It was then that I realized his hand was inches from mine on the railing, his fingers close enough that if I moved even slightly, they would touch. We lingered like that, the quiet settling around us, each of us bound by thoughts we couldn't say aloud. There was a tension between us I hadn't felt before. A charge I couldn't name but was suddenly aware of in a way that made my heart race. And just as quickly as it had come, he looked away, stepping back. "Good night, Evelyn," he said softly, his voice low. "Good night, Howard," I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. As he disappeared into the guest room, I stood there, feeling the cool night air, my heart beating louder than it had in years. I didn't sleep well that night, and I knew why. Memories, hazy and half-formed, drifted in and out of my mind. The glances we'd shared, the nearness of his hand on the railing, his low voice asking questions I hadn't expected. As the night wore on, I felt the weight of something I couldn't quite name, a stirring I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It felt foolish, out of place, like a memory from youth I'd forgotten. The next morning, I was up early, trying to shake off the remnants of that strange energy with a brisk walk along the lake. The cool air helped, if only slightly, and by the time I returned, I felt somewhat more like myself. I found Marian already awake, coffee in hand, and looking as well-rested as ever. "Morning, Evelyn. Did you sleep well?" she asked, smiling brightly. "Like a rock," I lied, pouring myself a cup. Howard joined us a moment later, giving a polite nod but looking tired, with a touch of dark circles under his eyes. I wondered if he'd slept any better than I had. Breakfast was light, and we made small talk, the three of us slipping back into a comfortable rhythm. Marian was her usual lively self, keeping the conversation going, and I could tell Howard was trying to engage as much as he could. But occasionally I caught his eyes on me, just a flicker of something there. An unspoken question. Each time I felt a strange thrill, quickly followed by guilt. After breakfast, Marian had errands to run, needing supplies from a nearby town for a work event the following week. Howard and I saw her off, and suddenly it was just the two of us, alone in the house. "Well," I said, feeling awkward, "I guess I should get to those things I've been putting off around here." "I can help," he offered, his tone casual, but his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "If you don't mind, that is." I hesitated. There was no reason for me to turn down his offer. His presence was comforting, even though it left me with an odd, unsettled feeling. "All right, I could use a hand in the garage. There's an old shelf I need moved." We worked in silence, moving boxes and clearing out the clutter. Our conversation started out light. Comments about Marian, about life, about getting older. But soon, the topics turned deeper, to those quiet subjects you only discuss when you're sure no one else is listening. "She and I," he trailed off, wiping his brow. "We're fine, you know, but sometimes I wonder if this is all there is. Or if it's just that we're used to each other." He glanced at me as though testing my reaction. I knew I should have brushed it off, offered something neutral and inconsequential. But something about the way he spoke made me want to give more. "I know what you mean," I replied, pulling a stray cobweb from a box and looking away. "There are times I wonder what my life would have been if I'd made different choices. Maybe something more exciting. But I guess most people think like that, don't they?" He chuckled softly, a sound tinged with resignation. "Yeah, I think most people do. But it's odd, isn't it? I'm 58 and still wondering if I've lived the life I was meant to." I looked at him, noticing for the first time the weariness in his face, a weight behind his eyes that went deeper than I'd expected. He was still looking at me, his expression softer than usual. There was a long pause as we both sat there, not moving, just watching each other. "Howard?" I started, not sure where I was going with my words. "Evelyn," he interrupted, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear. "Last night, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable." "No, of course not," I replied quickly, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. Well, it was unexpected, I suppose." He smiled, looking down, and for a moment, he seemed almost shy. "Maybe it's foolish to think about this at our age, but you make me wonder what it would be like if I'd met someone like you years ago." The words hung between us, weighted and dangerous. I knew this was the moment to laugh it off, to steer us back to safe ground. But something inside me resisted, something that had been quiet for years and was now stirring in response to his words. I reached out, touching his hand lightly, feeling the roughness of his skin. "We can't change the past," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "but sometimes, even a moment like this, it feels like enough, doesn't it?" His hand closed over mine, just for an instant, his eyes meeting mine. The room seemed to shrink, the world outside fading away until there was only this moment, hanging between us like the last breath before something irrevocable. And then, with a quiet sigh, he pulled his hand away, breaking the spell. We spent the rest of the day working side by side, not speaking of it again. But the connection we'd shared lingered, a soft ache beneath the surface, unspoken but understood. That evening, after Marian returned, we sat together by the fire in the living room, the three of us sipping on glasses of wine. Marian was animated, telling stories from her day in town, and Howard chimed in, laughing at her stories. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen earlier. I watched them, feeling a strange mix of emotions, guilt, longing, and an odd relief that Howard seemed happy again, even if just for the moment. It was late when Marian finally excused herself, stretching and yawning. "I'm calling it a night," she declared, already headed for the stairs. "Tomorrow, maybe we can go down to the farmer's market, Evelyn. I hear they have the best honey and fresh bread. And Howard." She glanced over her shoulder with a grin. "Don't stay up too late talking her ear off." Howard laughed, waving her off. "Wouldn't dream of it," he replied, but as she left, the silence settled over us once more, thick with things unsaid. I knew I should go to bed too. But part of me resisted, lingering there on the couch, the fire casting shadows across the room. "It's been a long day," I said softly, more to myself than to him. "It has," he agreed, his voice low. He was watching me, his gaze steady, unguarded. "But it's been a good day too." We sat there, the air between us heavy and charged, until he reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was such a simple gesture, so gentle that I barely registered it at first. But then his hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing my skin in a way that sent a thrill through me. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I don't know if this is a mistake, but—" I didn't let him finish. I didn't want him to. In that moment, all my reservations, all my guilt, melted away as I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was warm and soft, filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. When we pulled away, the silence was almost unbearable. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same emotions that were churning in me, but neither of us spoke. The kiss was brief, a moment of stolen intimacy that neither of us could explain or take back. "Good night, Howard," I whispered, finally breaking the silence. My voice was shaky, but I managed a small smile. "Good night, Evelyn," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he rose and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room, my heart racing. As I sat there, I felt a mix of emotions I could barely name. Joy, fear, guilt, and an undeniable sense of longing. What had I just done? And what would happen now? I didn't have any answers, only the knowledge that things would never be the same. The days that followed were a confusing blur of emotions, each moment spent with Marian and Howard carrying the weight of that kiss we'd shared. I found myself constantly on edge, balancing between the familiarity of my friendship with Marian and the new, unspoken connection with Howard. I knew we'd both crossed a line, and yet a part of me couldn't deny the thrill it had awakened. It was as if I'd been living behind glass, watching life pass by, and now suddenly that glass was shattered. The consequences, though, they were waiting. Every time I caught Howard's eye, every lingering touch of his hand reminded me of the risk. Then, one night, that line was crossed further. That evening, Marian had suggested a quiet dinner on the deck. She had an early meeting scheduled the next morning, so after the meal she excused herself early. Howard and I were left outside, the night air cool and laced with the scent of the lake and pine. The sky was clear, a deep indigo sprinkled with stars, and the moon cast a silvery light over the water. We sat side by side in silence, each of us lost in thought, our wine glasses resting between us on the table. The silence felt natural, like an understanding, one of those rare moments when words weren't necessary. Finally, I broke the quiet, feeling the need to address what had been lingering between us. "Howard," I began, searching for the right words, "about the other night. I don't think it was wise." He nodded, though his gaze was still focused on the dark expanse of the lake. "You're probably right," he replied softly. "But it didn't feel like a mistake, Evelyn. Not to me." His words struck me, and I felt myself unable to reply immediately. I could only watch him, his profile lit by the moon, his expression serious and yet gentle. I wanted to argue, to insist that this couldn't happen. But the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability, I knew we were both standing at the edge of something we hadn't planned but couldn't ignore. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding, and I felt the last of my reservations start to crumble. I should have pulled away, walked back into the safety of my house, locked the door behind me. But something held me there. Something deeper than mere attraction. It was as if, in that moment, Howard and I both understood each other in a way no one else ever had. Without a word, he leaned closer, his lips brushing mine again, this time slower, softer. It wasn't a kiss of urgency, but one filled with the weight of years, of missed chances, and words unspoken. This kiss felt like both a beginning and an ending. A choice that couldn't be undone. When he finally pulled back, his hand still held mine, and we sat there in silence. We both knew what this meant, that we couldn't go back, couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. And yet, in that moment, neither of us seemed to care about the consequences. We spent the rest of the night talking in whispers, confessing things we'd never shared with anyone. He told me of dreams he'd left behind, of the things he missed, the parts of himself he felt had been lost in the daily routines of life. I shared my own stories, of the solitude that had both comforted and confined me, of the loneliness that no one had ever guessed was there. When we finally parted that night, there was no grand declaration, no promises made. Only the quiet understanding that something had changed, and that we would each have to face it, in our own way, come morning. The next morning was an uneasy one. Marian, oblivious to the undercurrents, greeted us cheerfully and proposed a trip into town to visit the local farmers market. I went along, smiling, nodding, and responding as naturally as I could manage. But inside, my thoughts were racing. What were we doing? Each time Howard and I exchanged glances, my mind flashed back to the previous night, to the conversations and confessions we'd shared. I felt a pang of guilt as Marian looped her arm through mine, laughing as she recounted some anecdote from her work. She trusted me completely, and here I was, hiding the very thing that would break her heart if she knew. By the time we returned home, I was exhausted, emotionally frayed. I retreated to my room for some quiet, trying to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what I was feeling. But the truth was, I couldn't make sense of it. Part of me wanted to end this now, to walk away before things got even more complicated. And yet, another part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I was startled from my thoughts by a quiet knock at the door. It was Howard. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, opening the door wider and letting him in. We sat across from each other in the small sitting area, the air thick with things unspoken. He looked at me, his expression conflicted, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Evelyn, I don't know what this means," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just know that I haven't felt like this in a long time." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Howard, whatever this is, it's dangerous. We could lose everything if Marian finds out." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but pretending this didn't happen, that there's nothing here, that feels impossible too." We sat in silence, the weight of our words settling between us. I wanted to find an easy answer, a way out of this tangled web. But nothing seemed simple anymore. All I knew was that the feelings I had for him, whatever they were, weren't going to disappear. And as much as I wanted to protect my friendship with Marian, I couldn't deny the connection I felt with him. Maybe we just need some time," I suggested finally, feeling the helplessness of my own words. He nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. "Maybe," he replied, his voice resigned. "But I don't want to hurt you, Evelyn, or Marian. I don't want to hurt anyone." Neither do I whispered. But as I said it, I knew the damage had already been done. The next day, a tension simmered just beneath the surface. Howard and I moved around each other cautiously, as though we were afraid any small gesture might betray what had passed between us. Marian, though, seemed as oblivious as ever. She was in high spirits, making plans for future visits and talking about places she wanted us all to go together. But that evening, everything changed. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to react. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, when Marian called my name from the other room, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard. I walked into the living room, wiping my hands on a dish towel, only to find her standing near the sofa, her face a mixture of confusion and anger. She held a small folded note in her hand, the note Howard had slipped to me in a quiet moment that morning. I had tucked it away in my sweater pocket, but must have dropped it without realizing. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cold. My heart pounded as I tried to find the words. Marian. She held up a hand, silencing me. Her face was flushed, her eyes narrowed as she looked between Howard and me. "I'm not stupid, Evelyn. I see the way you've been acting. Both of you. I never thought." Her voice broke and she shook her head, clutching the note in her fist. Howard stood, trying to approach her, his face stricken. "Marian, it's not what you think," he began, his voice trembling. She laughed, a sound that was both bitter and full of disbelief. "Not what I think. Howard, you've been lying to me. Both of you have. My best friend and my husband." She looked at me then, her expression raw with betrayal. "How could you, Evelyn? How could you do this to me?" I took a shaky breath, my voice barely steady. "Marian, I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back, as though my words had only deepened her hurt. "I trusted you, Evelyn. I trusted both of you. But clearly, I was a fool." She turned away, gathering her things in a daze, her movements quick and tense. "I can't stay here," she muttered, almost to herself. "I need to leave." Howard tried to stop her, reaching out, but she pulled away, her face set in grim determination. Just don't," she whispered, her voice barely holding back the tears. Without another word, she left, the front door closing behind her with a final, heavy thud. Howard and I stood in the empty room, the silence pressing down on us, the enormity of what had just happened settling like a weight in the pit of my stomach. The next few days were a blur. Marian didn't answer my calls or messages, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. My best friend, the person I had known nearly my whole life, was gone, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. The hurt in her eyes haunted me, and the guilt gnawed at me constantly. Howard, too, was distant, lost in his own regret. We spoke little, each of us grappling with the consequences of our choices. In the evenings, he sat quietly on the deck, staring out over the lake, his face shadowed with remorse. I knew he felt the same weight of guilt, but his silence made it all the more unbearable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally approached him, needing to break the silence between us. "Howard, we need to talk. We can't go on like this, pretending it didn't happen." He looked at me, his face weary, his eyes heavy with regret. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't know what to do, Evelyn. I've lost her. I've lost everything." His words pierced me, filling me with a fresh wave of guilt and sorrow. "I know we can't change what happened, but maybe it's best if we go our separate ways." He nodded slowly, as though he'd known this all along. "You're probably right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we both need time, away from each other, to figure out what this all means." We sat together in silence, watching the last light fade over the lake, knowing that this was goodbye. In that moment, I understood that while we had shared something real, something that had meant something to both of us, it wasn't enough to overcome the pain we'd caused. The next morning, Howard packed his things and left, leaving only a quiet emptiness behind. The weeks that followed were filled with emptiness and reflection. I spent long days by the lake, alone with my thoughts, reliving every moment, every decision that had led to this. I had lost not only Marion, but also the fragile connection I'd felt with Howard. And for what? A moment of stolen intimacy? A brief respite from loneliness? As the days passed, I began to accept the reality of my choices. I had betrayed someone who trusted me completely, someone who had been a constant in my life through every hardship. I knew that no apology would ever be enough to repair the damage I'd done, but I also knew that I couldn't live in regret forever. One afternoon, I took a long walk through the woods surrounding my home, letting the quiet soothe my thoughts. I thought of Marion, of the friendship we'd shared, and the memories we'd created over the years. I realized that while I might never have the chance to make things right with her, I could at least strive to live in a way that honored what we'd once shared. It was time to let go, to forgive myself and move forward. There was no going back to the life I'd known, but perhaps with time, there could be something new. Something built on honesty and self-acceptance. Months later, I received a letter. It was from Marion. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. The letter was brief, her words carefully chosen. She wrote that while the pain of betrayal would take time to heal, she understood that we were all human, capable of making mistakes. She didn't forgive me, not fully, but she wished me peace. She hoped I would find a way to live without the burden of guilt. Her words were bittersweet, but they held a glimmer of hope. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a beginning, a small step toward healing. As I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I realized that while I couldn't undo the past, I could choose how to move forward. I would carry Marion's words with me, a reminder of the cost of my choices, and the importance of honesty, of loyalty, and of the quiet courage it takes to live a life without regrets. In the end, that brief connection with Howard, however intense, had faded, but the lesson it left was one I would carry for the rest of my days. I had learned about the fragility of trust, the weight of desire, and the unrelenting need for forgiveness, not only from others, but from myself. And so I stepped out into the morning light, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that I would move forward one step at a time. It wasn't the first time I'd worn something casual around the house, but that morning, the air felt different. The sun poured through the windows, lighting up the living room as I bent over to tie the laces on my sneakers. I was in my favorite nightgown, a soft, loose-fitting thing that barely reached my knees. I hadn't even thought about it. Richard, my husband, was out of town for work, and it was just another lazy Sunday morning at home. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me but didn't register it right away. My focus was on the stubborn knot in my laces. When I finally straightened up and turned around, there he was. Nate. He stood frozen in the doorway, a bottle of water in his hand, his eyes wide and darting anywhere but directly at me. I could see his throat bob as he swallowed hard, his cheeks flushing slightly as he quickly glanced away. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. Then it hit me. The way I was bent over, the way the light hit me, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long before he forced himself to look anywhere else. I didn't mean to interrupt, he stammered, taking a step back. It's fine, I said quickly, brushing my hair out of my face as if that would somehow change the mood in the room. I was just heading out for a walk. He nodded, his movements stiff. Right, I'll let you get to it. And just like that, he disappeared down the hall. But the energy he left behind lingered, crackling like static electricity in the air. I sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, trying to shake the tension out of my body. Nate was my stepson. He'd moved in just a few months ago, taking a break after graduate school while figuring out his next steps. I'd always thought of him as quiet and polite, endearingly so. But that moment in the living room had shifted something, and I couldn't deny it. Something had changed. After that morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, an awkward, fleeting moment, blown out of proportion by my overactive mind. But the way Nate looked at me, the way he quickly left the room, like he'd done something wrong, kept replaying in my head. I've been Catherine Boyd for almost 3 years now, though my last name still doesn't feel like it belongs to me. I was Catherine Lang for most of my life, a single mom raising my daughter Tara after my first husband left when she was only 6. Meeting Richard was supposed to be my happy ending. A respectable, successful attorney in his early 60s, he swept me off my feet with his old-fashioned charm. He made me feel like I mattered again after years of being invisible. But 3 years in, marriage to Richard isn't quite what I expected. Don't get me wrong, he's kind and steady. But he's also a workaholic who seems more married to his career than to me. He's often gone late into the evenings or traveling for cases, leaving me alone in a house that feels too big and too quiet. That's where Nate comes in. Nate is Richard's son from his first marriage. He's 25, just finished his master's in computer science, and is trying to find his footing in the world. When he moved in with us a few months ago, I barely gave it a second thought. At first, it was nice having someone else around. Nate is quiet and polite, with a sharp wit that only comes out once he's comfortable. He works as a contractor for a game development company, one I just happen to be a senior project manager at. It's a funny coincidence that occasionally overlaps in work conversations, but nothing too serious. At least, it wasn't serious until now. That awkward moment in the living room was the first time I noticed Nate as anything other than my stepson. Before that, he was just part of Richard's world, a polite young man trying to figure out his next steps. But after that morning, I started noticing him in ways I hadn't before. The way his t-shirts clung to his frame, the muscles of his arms visible even when he was doing something as mundane as making coffee. The way he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose when he was focused on his laptop. The way he smiled, a little crooked, a little shy, but always charming. I hated myself for noticing. A week later, we found ourselves alone in the house again. Richard had taken an impromptu business trip, leaving Nate and me to fend for ourselves. That evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Nate walked in. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed casually as he watched me chop vegetables. "Smells good," he said, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my focus on the cutting board. "It's just spaghetti, nothing fancy." "Still better than what I'd make," he said with a laugh. I glanced at him and couldn't help but smile. "You don't cook?" "Not unless you count microwaving leftovers," he said, shrugging. I shook my head, laughing softly. "That's not cooking." He grinned, and for a moment, the air between us felt lighter. But then I felt it again, that flicker of tension, like a spark catching fire. When I turned back to the counter, I could feel his eyes on me. Later that night, I was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, when Nate joined me. He sat on the other end, keeping a respectable distance, but his presence filled the room. "What are you watching?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. "Just some old movie," I said, waving a hand dismissively. He leaned back, stretching his arms across the top of the couch. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the TV. I was hyper-aware of how close he was, the faint scent of his cologne reaching me. At one point, I glanced over at him and found him already looking at me. He didn't look away this time. "Catherine," he said softly, his tone unreadable. "Yes?" I asked, my heart beating faster. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. But before he could say anything, he seemed to think better of it and turned back to the TV. "Nothing," he said after a pause. But it wasn't nothing. I knew that. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the growing tension between us. It was in the way his hand brushed against mine when he handed me a plate. The way our conversations lingered a little too long. The way his gaze sometimes dropped to my lips when I spoke. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just him. It was me too. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Richard, how distant he'd been lately, how he barely seemed to notice me anymore. And then I thought about Nate, how he looked at me like I was someone worth noticing. It wasn't fair to anyone involved, least of all me. But fair didn't matter. What mattered was the spark I hadn't felt in years. The pull I couldn't seem to resist. Something was bound to happen. It was only a matter of time. The moment it happened, I knew there was no going back. It started like so many other nights since Nate moved in. Quiet, unassuming. Richard was out of town again, leaving the house to the two of us. I was in the kitchen finishing a glass of wine, savoring the stillness of the evening, when Nate walked in. "Late night?" he asked, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. I shrugged, swirling the wine in my glass. "Just unwinding." He leaned against the counter, the faint glow of the kitchen light casting shadows across his face. "You work too hard, you know that?" I laughed softly. "You sound like Richard." "Richard doesn't notice half the things you do," he said, his tone more serious than I expected. The comment caught me off guard, and I looked up at him. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I notice," he added quietly. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I set my glass down and turned toward the hallway. "Good night, Nate," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But before I could take a step, I felt his hand on my arm. It wasn't aggressive or forceful. His touch was light, tentative, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away, but I didn't. "Catherine," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What is there to talk about?" His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then, as if something inside him snapped, he closed the distance between us. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative at first, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. I should have. Every logical part of me screamed to push him away, to end this before it went any further. But the way he kissed me, the way his hands gently cupped my face, the way his breath hitched when I leaned into him, made every rational thought disappear. I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent with every passing second. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. The counter pressed against my back, grounding me in the reality of what we were doing. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. "We can't," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did I. That night, we didn't sleep. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, like I was something precious, something he couldn't believe he was allowed to have. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the TV casting shadows across the room. Nate's fingers traced lazy patterns on my arm, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. I didn't answer right away. Did I? I knew I should. I knew this was wrong on so many levels. But as I looked at him, his face soft and open in the dim light, I couldn't bring myself to lie. "No," I said finally. His lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, and he pulled me closer. In the days that followed, I told myself it would never happen again. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into work and pretending the night we shared was just a fleeting mistake. But the memory of his touch, the way he made me feel, lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to fade. And then it happened again. It was late on a Friday night, and I was sitting in my office at home, buried in project deadlines. Richard was out of town, again, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of my laptop. I didn't hear Nate come in until he was standing in the doorway. "Still working?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." He stepped into the room, leaning against the desk. "You shouldn't work so late. You'll burn out." I sighed, closing my laptop. Deadlines don't wait. He studied me for a moment, his gaze lingering in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You're always taking care of everyone else," he said quietly. "When do you let someone take care of you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face before I could speak. "Catherine?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. My heart raced as he leaned closer, his lips inches from mine. I knew I should stop him, knew I should put an end to whatever this was becoming. But when his mouth met mine, I couldn't. After that night, there was no denying it anymore. We started finding excuses to be alone together. Quiet moments in the house when Richard wasn't around, late-night conversations that always ended the same way. The secrecy only made it more intoxicating. Every touch, every stolen kiss, felt like a defiance of the rules we were breaking. But with each encounter, the weight of what we were doing grew heavier. "This is dangerous," I said one night as we lay in bed, the room lit only by the faint glow of the moon. "I don't care," Nate said, his voice firm. "Do you?" I hesitated, my heart aching with the truth. "No," I admitted, "but I did care. I cared about what would happen if we got caught, about the life I was risking for something that couldn't possibly last. And yet, I couldn't stop." After that second night, there was no pretending it wouldn't happen again. We fell into a rhythm, one that was both thrilling and terrifying. It started small. His hand brushing against mine as we passed each other in the hallway, whispered conversations late at night when the house was still. But it didn't take long for those moments to spiral into something much bigger. One Friday evening, Richard called to let me know he'd be staying late at the office. By now, it was almost expected. Another late-night case, another excuse. I'd barely listened to his explanation as I stirred the pot of pasta on the stove, my mind elsewhere. When Nate walked into the kitchen, the tension hit immediately. He stood there for a moment, watching me with that quiet intensity that had become impossible to ignore. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, trying to sound casual. "Smells good," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, and suddenly the space between us felt much smaller. He was close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jawline, the way his shirt clung to his chest. Neither of us spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Catherine," he said, his voice low. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, with Richard, with all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "Are you happy?" I hesitated, the truth pressing against my lips. "It's complicated," I said finally. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "It shouldn't be." The moment stretched between us, and before I could think better of it, I leaned into him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and suddenly nothing else mattered. After that, there was no holding back. We started meeting in secret, quick, stolen moments around the house while Richard was at work, and long, passionate nights when the opportunity arose. Each time felt more reckless than the last, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. One afternoon, while Richard was at the office, Nate and I found ourselves alone in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when he came in and sat beside me. "Don't you ever get tired of pretending?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing between us, "sneaking around, hiding what we feel." I sighed, setting my phone aside. "We don't have a choice, Nate. You know that." He leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "What if we did?" His words lingered in the air, tempting and dangerous. But I couldn't let myself think about that, not yet. Work became another layer of complication. Nate's contract with Apex Interactive meant that we saw each other outside of the house too. At first we were careful, keeping our distance during meetings, avoiding lingering in the same spaces. But it wasn't long before the lines blurred. One afternoon I was working late in my office when Nate knocked on the door. "Come in," I said without looking up, assuming it was my assistant Kara. When I saw him standing there, my heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" I asked, glancing at the clock. "Needed to talk to you about the new campaign," he said, closing the door behind him. I frowned, confused. "That's not my department. You should—" "Catherine," he said, cutting me off. "You know why I'm here." His gaze held mine, and suddenly, the small office felt suffocating. Before I could protest, he crossed the room and kissed me. It was impulsive, reckless, and completely inappropriate, but as his hands tangled in my hair and my back pressed against the desk, I couldn't bring myself to care. Our affair was like a fire, intense, consuming, and impossible to control. We started meeting in places that felt riskier with each passing day. A hotel downtown became our go-to spot, a safe haven where we could let our guard down. I wish we didn't have to hide, Nate said one night as we lay tangled together in the dimly lit room. I traced a finger along his chest, my heart aching with the weight of his words. You know we don't have a choice. Maybe you don't, he said quietly. His words stung, but I didn't respond. Deep down, I knew he was right. It wasn't just the secrecy that made things complicated. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how deeply I was falling for him. It wasn't just about the way he made me feel physically, though that was undeniable. It was the way he listened. The way he made me laugh, the way he saw me in a way Richard never did. But with every high came the looming threat of exposure. Richard started noticing my distant behavior. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, he gave me a long, searching look. Is everything okay? He asked finally. Of course, I said quickly, forcing a smile. You've been distracted lately, he said. Is it work? Yes, I lied. Just a lot on my plate right now. He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. At work, Kara became another source of tension. As my assistant, she was privy to more of my life than most, and I started to notice her watching me more closely. One afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting, she pulled me aside. Is everything okay? She asked, her tone carefully neutral. Why wouldn't it be? I replied, feigning ignorance. She hesitated, her gaze lingering. No reason, you've just seemed different lately. I forced a laugh, brushing her off. Just work stress, nothing to worry about. But the way she looked at me made it clear she wasn't convinced. Despite the growing tension, I couldn't stop. Nate had become my escape, my sanctuary in a life that felt increasingly suffocating. But as much as I wanted to believe we could keep this up forever, a part of me knew the truth. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I always knew it would fall apart. Affairs like ours are fragile things, built on secrets and lies. The thrill can only last so long before reality catches up. It started with Kara. One afternoon, I returned from a meeting to find her standing by my desk, holding my phone. My heart sank as I saw the lock screen still lit up, a message from Nate flashing across it. Kara, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, what are you doing? She looked up at me, her face carefully blank. Your phone was buzzing. I thought it might be important. I crossed the room, snatching the phone from her hand. Thank you, I said, my tone clipped. But as I turned away, I saw the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. It's none of my business, of course, she said lightly. But maybe you should be more careful about where you leave your phone. The implication hung in the air, sharp and heavy. I tried to brush it off, but Kara's demeanor toward me shifted after that. She was polite, professional even, but there was a new edge to her tone, an unspoken challenge in the way she looked at me. It wasn't long before I started noticing the whispers, the subtle glances exchanged between colleagues as I walked through the office. And then, there was Richard. That evening, as I sat in the living room scrolling through emails, Richard came in and sat across from me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke. Catherine, is there something you want to tell me? My stomach tightened. What do you mean? You've been distant lately, he said, choosing his words carefully. And I've noticed how much time you've been spending with Nate. The mention of Nate sent a jolt of panic through me. He's your son, Richard, I said quickly. Of course, I'm going to spend time with him. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave mine. Just make sure you're not crossing any lines. It was a warning, plain and simple. The breaking point came a week later. I was in my office going over the final revisions for a campaign when I got the email. Subject, HR inquiry, immediate attention required. The message was short and direct. I was to meet with Human Resources at 2 p.m. that afternoon to discuss a serious matter. My blood ran cold. When I arrived at the HR office, I was greeted by Victoria, the head of HR, and another manager I didn't recognize. Their expressions were neutral, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Catherine, thank you for coming, Victoria said, gesturing for me to sit. As soon as I did, she slid a folder across the table toward me. These were brought to our attention anonymously, she said. I opened the folder, my hands trembling. Inside were printed copies of emails and texts between Nate and me, messages that left little room for interpretation. This is a serious breach of company policy, Victoria continued. We're conducting a full investigation, but we need you to confirm whether these messages are authentic. I stared at the pages, my heart pounding. Denying it would be pointless, the evidence was damning. Yes, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. They're real. Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you for your honesty. We'll be in touch once the investigation is complete. The meeting ended, and I walked out of the office, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. That night, Richard confronted me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of wine when he came in. His face was flushed with anger, his voice tight as he spoke. I know, he said, slamming his hand down on the table. I know about you and Nate. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Richard, Don't, he snapped. Don't you dare try to deny it. His words cut through me like a knife, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. How long? He demanded. How long has this been going on? I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. A few months, I admitted quietly. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. I trusted you, Catherine. I trusted you with my son. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, my voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. Well, you did, he said coldly. And now, you can pack your things and get out. By the time Nate came home, Richard had left for the night, slamming the door behind him. Nate found me sitting on the couch, my face buried in my hands. What happened? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Richard knows, I said, looking up at him. His face paled. What did he say? He wants me to leave, I said, my voice hollow. Nate sat down beside me, his hand resting on my knee. Then we'll go together, he said firmly. I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. No, Nate, this has gone too far. He frowned, his grip tightening. What are you saying? I'm saying we can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. It's over. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like I'd slapped him. You don't mean that. I do, I said, though the words felt like poison. He stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. You're just scared, he said. You care more about what people think than about us. That's not true, I said, my voice breaking. Isn't it? He shot back, his eyes blazing. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night, as I lay alone in the bed I'd once shared with Richard, I realized how much I'd lost. My marriage, my career, my home, all of it had crumbled because of choices I couldn't take back. And yet, as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't decide which hurt more, the consequences of what I'd done, or the thought of never seeing Nate again. It's been 6 months since everything fell apart. I'm sitting in a small, sunlit apartment on the other side of town, far from the house that once felt more like Richard's than mine. The life I built there, the one that looked so polished from the outside, feels like a distant memory. I resigned from Apex Interactive after the HR investigation concluded. They didn't fire me, but the writing was on the wall. A quiet resignation was the only way to preserve what little dignity I had left. Richard filed for divorce the day after he confronted me. The process was swift and cold. Just signatures on papers, no long arguments or drawn-out negotiations. He couldn't even look at me during the mediation. And Nate? He moved out the same week I did. I don't know where he went, and I haven't heard from him since. The days are quieter now. Too quiet. I picked up freelance work to pay the bills, but it doesn't fill the void. My evenings are spent staring at the city skyline from my tiny balcony, a glass of wine in hand, wondering where it all went wrong, and where I might go from here. At first, I blamed Nate for everything. For crossing the line, for tempting me, for making me feel things I hadn't felt in years. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about him. I was lonely. Richard had been gone long before Nate came into the picture, disappearing behind late nights at the office and a wall of indifference. I craved attention, affection, the kind of spark that reminded me I was still alive. And Nate gave me that. I don't regret the way he made me feel. But I regret the price we both paid. One rainy evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through an old photo album, my phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Nate, my heart pounded as I stared at the message. It was short, just a few words, but they hit me like a freight train. I miss you. Can we talk? I wanted to ignore it. I told myself I should, but the truth was, I missed him too. I spent the next hour staring at the phone, typing and deleting responses. Finally, I settled on the only thing I could say. Come over. When I opened the door, he was standing there, soaked from the rain but looking exactly as I remembered. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I didn't think you'd answer, he said finally. Neither did I admitted. He stepped inside, dripping water onto the floor, but I didn't care. I just stood there, my emotions swirling, relief, guilt, hope, and something I wasn't ready to name. I've thought about you every day, he said, his voice low. I know we messed up, but I don't care. Stop, I said, cutting him off. Don't say it. Not yet. He looked at me, confused, but he didn't argue. We sat on the couch, the sound of rain filling the silence between us. I don't know if we can fix this, I said finally, my voice trembling. But I know I can't keep pretending you don't matter to me. You do matter to me, he said, his voice firm. You always have. The sincerity in his words broke something inside me, and before I could think better of it, I reached for him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what comes next for us. Maybe this is just another mistake, another choice I'll regret. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a chance to rebuild something from the wreckage we left behind. All I know is that I'm not ready to let go. Not yet.